Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I'm going to be reviewing a short story collection by H.P. Lovecraft, and that is the Randolph Carter Tales. The specific edition that I read was by Arcturus Classics, I believe is the publishing for that. And it came with 5 short stories, those being The Statement of Randolph Carter, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, The Unnameable, The Silver Key, and Through the Gates of the Silver Key. Just in case you happen to find these stories in other editions, I know that there are many different editions of Lovecraft collections and they often have different things in them, so if you're wondering about the specific stories I'm going to talk about in this video, those are what those are. So I was very excited to read this collection for 2 reasons. One, because it's more Lovecraft, and Lovecraft is one of my favorite authors, but also because I still have a few stories that I haven't read, but for the most part, reading this collection would basically finish up my Lovecraft collection. And like I said, there's probably a few odd stories here and there that I still haven't read, but I've read the vast majority of his work at this point. And so for this review, I'm probably going to talk about each story individually. I might talk a little bit about them overall as well. But to start out with something that I want to say about them overall that is not what I expected, but something that I enjoyed, is that despite the fact that Lovecraft was typically a horror author, and the vast majority of his work is horror or adjacent to horror, and this does have some horror elements to it, but this isn't really a horror collection. There's some horror-ish stuff in there, like The Unnameable, I would say, as well as The Statement of Randolph Carter, both have kind of horror endings, but none of these are really horror stories, which was kind of a pleasant surprise. Not that I don't love Lovecraft's horror stories, because I do, but it was a nice change of pace. So to start talking about each of these stories, the first one in this collection, and also the longest one, and one of the longest stories Lovecraft ever wrote, is the novella called The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. Again, this is one of his longest stories. I think it was about 130, 140 pages, and this collection in general was around 190, I believe, so it was pretty lengthy. This story follows the character of Randolph Carter, who is involved in all of these stories. I believe he only appeared in 1 or 2 other Lovecraft stories, but this covers the majority of his presence in Lovecraft, which is kind of interesting because he doesn't, Lovecraft never really used a lot of the same characters. He used some of the same, Cthulhu mythos deities or entities or whatever you want to refer to them as. But he didn't usually use the same human characters. He might have referenced them here and there, but there weren't many cases where he actually brought in the same character multiple times and had an actual, continuity between stories. But all of these do. And actually, Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, The Silver Key, and Through the Gates of the Silver Key are all parts of one story that have kind of through lines to them, which is kind of cool. But Dream Quest is a story of Randolph Carter, who wants to go to this place where the gods are, or whatever, within the Dreamlands, which is basically I don't know if it would be an alternate dimension or what, but it's a place, like an actual physical real place. It's not just in your dreams, it's an actual place where you go when you dream, that you access in certain ways or whatever, and he goes to the Dreamlands and he wants to go to this place where the gods are or whatever, and I really enjoyed this story a lot. It feels very different from the usual Lovecraft. You get a lot of world building in this story. He's traveling throughout the Dreamlands and he encounters lots of different characters, lots of different cultures, lots of different landscapes. There's these toad people. There are sentient talking cats, which was quite entertaining. And there's some other ones. There's these creatures like night gaunts and different ones. It's really interesting. There's a lot of different stuff going on, and I really enjoyed that it was more of just kind of an adventure through this world. It was kind of cool, and very different from the usual Lovecraft thing, because usually Lovecraft is taking place in the real world, occasionally dipping into some other worldly kind of stuff, but usually takes place in the real world with supernatural or cosmic horror elements going on within it. So this was very unique for that reason, and I really enjoyed that. And yeah, I really liked this story. It was fun to read, a lot of interesting world building stuff, like I said. I also enjoyed how it tied into Lovecraft's greater works. There sometimes is crossover between Lovecraft's works in terms of, like I said, using the same deities, occasionally referencing characters or events from other works, but not that often. The same locations, you know, he references the town of Arkham, which he created for his stories, and some stories take place in Arkham, things like that. But this one has a whole bunch of references to other Lovecraft works, which makes me kind of glad that this was one of the last Lovecraft stories that I read, because then I could kind of make the connections to everything. You know, you get connections to several of his other Dreamland stories. There's another collection that I've actually reviewed on the channel called Stories of the Dreamlands, which this references several things from that. You know, you have the cats from Ulthar, which have a story about them. You have Celophaeus, which is a part of the Dreamlands that has a story about it. I believe there was some stuff from the White Ship that was in there. You have Pikmin from Pikmin's model showing up here. You know, all kinds of different stuff. You have Nyarlathotep and Azathoth being mentioned, which are two of the kind of deities who show up. They don't really show up a whole lot in his stories, but they're mentioned frequently. And stuff like that. Like, this just is chock full of references to other works that Lovecraft made, which is super cool. Very fun to read for that reason as well. So I really enjoyed this story a lot. Very different feeling, but I did really enjoy it. The next story in here is The Statement of Randolph Carter. This is the only story in this collection that I had actually read before. Everything else was a first time for me. This one was okay. This one and The Unnameable for me, which I guess I'll talk about both of these together because, you know, I have very similar feelings on them, even though The Unnameable is actually the last story in this collection. These two for me were just okay. I enjoyed the twist at the end. You know, the ending of Statement of Randolph Carter was pretty good, but otherwise these two were really short. They didn't have that much substance to them, I think. And they just weren't really that engaging to me. The other three stories, on the other hand, I did really enjoy. And speaking of the other stories, now let's talk about The Silver Key, which is another shorter one, kind of similar in length to those last two I mentioned, but I enjoyed this one a little more. In this one, it kind of has Randolph Carter, again, kind of after Dream Quest. It's kind of a sequel to that, and he is just kind of distressed because he's not able to access the Dreamlands, and that's where he wants to be. And so there's this silver key, which is supposed to be able to get him there or whatever, and he's just kind of having a time about that. And eventually he just disappears. There's some weird stuff that have been going on with him, but eventually he disappears, and people don't really know what's up with that. And that plays into the next story as well, which is Through the Gates of the Silver Key, which is a little bit of a frame story. It starts and ends with this group of people who, you know, Randolph Carter's disappeared, so they're like, okay, we're gonna try to figure out what to do with his belongings and his property and all this stuff. And then this guy's like, no, I'm gonna tell you the story of what happened to him. Because somehow they happen to know what happened to Randolph Carter, which the revelation of how that is, I actually really enjoyed. This story, that's kind of the frame story, that's what this is being told to the other people. And this basically tells about what happened to Randolph Carter, where he went. And I really, really enjoyed this story. I was really looking forward to reading this one. This was the one that I was most looking forward to out of the bunch. Because it includes the Lovecraft entity Yog-Sothoth, which is one of my favorite ones. I find him very interesting. And so I was looking forward to seeing that and how that plays into everything. And I really enjoyed that aspect of the story. It's hard for me to talk about this story without spoiling it, because I don't want to spoil this story in case you don't really know anything about it. I knew some things going into it, but essentially there's some really weird and interesting stuff that goes on with, you know, Yog-Sothoth is kind of the guardian to the gate of all reality, and once you go through, you can never really return. your mind will just know things that you can't unknow and all this stuff. And the way that played into the story was really cool. And I really liked this story overall. It's probably my favorite in the collection, which might partially be due to how much I was excited to read it, but I really did enjoy it. It was definitely a page turner for me, as Randolph Carter started, stuff started happening to him, and I just was really into it and I couldn't get enough of it. And I really enjoyed it a lot. As far as these stories overall, I really do enjoy the kind of trilogy setup that Dream Quest, Silver Key, and Through the Gates of the Silver Key has. Of course, they're not equal. Like, Dream Quest is like 100 and some pages. The Silver Key is like 10 pages, maybe less, and Through the Gates of the Silver Key was, I think, around 40. So they're not equal in terms of length and how deeply they are gone into. But I enjoyed that setup. That story was really interesting. I can envision that being like a really cool, maybe like a TV series or even a movie or something like that. I think would be really cool. Of course, it would be very difficult to adapt Lovecraft directly like that, but it would be really cool if it happened. I just really liked that story. I thought Randolph Carter was quite an interesting character and how he developed over the course of those stories. Which again is not something you get a whole lot with Lovecraft. I think you tend to get a lot of protagonists who are, seeking out this stuff that they probably shouldn't be, and end up not having very fun things happen to them, which is also kind of the case with Randolph Carter because it's Lovecraft. But he goes through some interesting developments over the course of these stories that I really enjoyed. And I really liked them in general. I think Dream Quest works pretty well on its own if you were to just read that, but I think reading the whole set of 3 is really cool and really interesting. The one thing that I did not like about this collection, aside from The Unnameable and Statement of Randolph Carter not quite hooking me as much, is the order that the stories are placed in. Like I said, you start out with Dream Quest, and then you have Statement of Randolph Carter, and then the 2 Silver Key stories, and then The Unnameable at the end. As far as the small amount of research that I've done, which I might be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm correct, the 2 stories that I bunched together there, the Statement of Randolph Carter and The Unnameable, take place before the 3 Dreamland stories. So I don't really like the order that they were presented in this. I think it makes sense because the Dream Quest is the most popular story out of the bunch easily. So it makes sense why that was put right at the front. But I would have liked it better if they had actually been presented in chronological order. I think it would have been a little bit better because the way that things go in those 3 connected stories, it feels very odd for you to have another one after that. So I would have liked to have them in a different order. Granted, you could just look up what order to read them in and read them in that order. I just would have liked to see them actually presented in that order in this edition. But otherwise, I really enjoyed this collection a whole lot. And out of the Lovecraft collections that I have read, granted, several of them, at least a couple of them, have several more stories in these than this edition has. But out of the ones that I have read, this is arguably my favorite. I loved Dream Quest and the 2 Silver Key stories. They are probably among my favorite Lovecraft stories that I have read at the moment. I really enjoyed them a lot. And even though I wasn't as much into the other 2 stories, they were short enough that I can kind of brush them off and be like, they were okay, but really the main event is these other 3 stories that take up the vast majority of the page time. And so I really enjoyed this collection a whole lot. It was very different, very unique for Lovecraft, but I really had a great time with it. Very interesting, lots of cool world building stuff, lots of awesome connections to his other works, and just this delivered on a lot of things that I have been wanting to see from Lovecraft for some time. So for this being potentially my first time reading a Lovecraft collection, I don't think I could ask for a better final entry because I really loved this collection, and like I said, it's maybe my favorite that I've read. Granted, I have another edition that has a whole bunch of his stories, including several of my favorites. So if I had to pick, if I could only read one from now on, it probably would be that one. But in terms of just the, how much is here and how much of it I absolutely loved, I mean, I loved a good, 90% of what was in this collection, which typically doesn't happen for my other Lovecraft collections. Typically, it's a little bit more uneven. But I really loved this collection a lot, and I would highly recommend it if you have not read it before, if you're into Lovecraft or you're interested in Lovecraft. I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting with this. I think also part of the reason why I really liked it is because it had so many references to other things, and I think that being able to kind of get all of those, granted you don't need to get all of those to enjoy these, but I think, seeing those things was really cool. So I would still recommend starting with stuff like The Shadow of Innsmouth or Call of Cthulhu or Dunwich Horror, things like that. But I did really enjoy this collection, and I would highly recommend reading it if you're a Lovecraft fan and you have not read them yet. And so as far as a rating out of 10 that I would give this collection, I would give it a 9 out of 10. I really loved it. It was fantastic. And like I said, probably my favorite Lovecraft collection that I've read. So that's pretty much it for this review. So let me know down in the comments if you have read this collection, or at least the stories in this collection, and what you thought of them. Did you love them as much as I did, or were you a little more mixed on them? I haven't seen a whole lot of community opinions on these stories, but I do frequently listen to the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast, their old episodes where they covered a lot of his stories. And I actually just earlier today, I was listening to the ones covering these stories, and I remember they didn't really care much for the first Silver Key story. So I'm curious what everyone's thoughts on all of these stories are. I really enjoyed them a lot. So that is pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.